Imagine a sprawling, decaying digital wasteland, a space where the very people supposed to protect you, the authorities, the guardians of the system, have completely abandoned their posts. Welcome to Days Explainer. We're diving deep into a massive 450-page forensic documentary known as the Aegis Monolith. Specifically, we're unpacking a highly complex case study titled The Collapse of the Shield, FBI Deflection, and the Peoria Hub Nullity. The source text kicks off with what it calls the 7:28 a.m. NUKE, the exact moment this massive forensic payload was delivered to federal authorities, only to be met with instant bureaucratic deflection. It describes a gritty, almost urban Mad Max reality of institutional survival, where the system meant to shield citizens instead looks the other way. We're going to explore how the author of this document put local departments and federal agencies on public notice for systemic neglect, outlining what they allege are massive color of law violations.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To really understand the sheer scale of the Aegis Monolith, we have to look at what the document's author, who refers to themselves simply as the architect, calls their very first forensic strike. And it hinges entirely on this idea. You can spin a story to a judge, but you absolutely cannot lie to a server log. The text alleges that hexadecimal metadata was quite literally weaponized against a network of corrupt fiduciaries, a group the author dubs the Syndicate. According to the architect, human memory fades, people lie, people obfuscate, but cryptographic server logs, they hold an absolute, mathematically verifiable truth. This is the foundation of the entire text. It's about bypassing the subjective stories and striking directly at the undeniable digital footprint left behind by this so-called syndicate.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of what we are talking about. The architect didn't just write a legal complaint. According to the text, they built a sprawling, impenetrable defense grid. The Aegis Monolith is presented as an 8-volume narrative architecture. The document vividly describes a strategic, necessary extraction, abandoning what it calls the decaying California grid to establish a completely hardened, sovereign stronghold known as the Peoria Hub. Now, why go through all this? The text asserts that this fortress was meticulously constructed for one singular purpose: to protect the estate's primary beneficiary, referred to affectionately as the matriarch, from what are described as predatory, systemic extractions. It's framed as building a brand new world, just to keep the old one out.
Now, we need to talk about a deeply unsettling concept outlined in this text. It's a term the architect coins as the Phoenix Drift. This is where the document takes on a really dark asphalt Gothic reality. According to the source, the authorities involved, who the author chillingly refers to as standardized faces, didn't use physical force. No, they used something much quieter but arguably just as destructive. They weaponized administrative friction. The text alleges that by strangling a vulnerable target with endless policy manuals, bureaucratic red tape, and manufactured delays, these standardized faces intentionally exhausted the family. The alleged goal? To legally isolate the matriarch and force a total surrender of her estate, all without ever throwing a single physical punch.
To see how this unfolded, we really have to track the chronology of what the document labels as extraction pulses. The text maps this out meticulously, starting with a moment of systemic neglect in San Jose in 2020, which it terms the kinetic breach. But, systemic neglect allegedly escalated into outright theft. By 2021, the timeline marks a trust extraction, claiming a massive digital theft of $250,000. In response, the architect details initiating a quantum burst in 2024, essentially firing up the defenses of the new Peoria Hub to stabilize their reality. All of this tension, according to the document, ultimately boiled over into the devastating 2026 hospice siege. It's a roadmap of escalation, showing how bureaucratic apathy allegedly mutated into active financial extraction.
Let's move to our next forensic strike, which brings us to the actual legal mechanics of this defense. The architect uses a strategy they call legal alchemy. They treat federal statutes not just as laws, but as spells or weapons designed to jam the gears of a corrupt grid. In the wake of the 2020 kinetic breach, the text details the weaponization of Title 42 of the U.S. Code, Section 1983. This specific civil action is designed for the deprivation of rights. The document argues that this statute acts as a literal stripping mechanism, peeling away the absolute immunity that those standardized faces usually hide behind. By invoking this, the architect legally reclassified local police deflection and systemic failure as a direct, compensable federal offense. It's a brilliant, almost system-punk method of flipping the script on the authorities.
Let's see how this builds into the broader investigation, especially concerning the FBI and federal oversight. The document draws this incredibly sharp, unavoidable contrast between plausible deniability and hard forensic reality. On one side, you have the syndicate. According to the text, these fiduciaries claimed that missing assets and forged documents were simply clerical errors, just the normal, innocent mistakes of a busy system. But on the other side, you have the architect, pointing directly at the server logs. The text claims these logs expose simultaneous bot signing and coordinated digital forgery. The document is essentially saying, look, you can call it a paperwork glitch all you want, but the forensic data proves this was an automated, intentional extraction.
And speaking of that forensic data, there's one specific number the Aegis monolith zeroes in on to prove its point. 0.4. That's 0.4 seconds. According to the architect's exhaustive metadata audit, 3 entirely distinct human signatures were supposedly applied to highly complex legal documents within this tiny fraction of a second. Think about that for a moment. Human biology literally cannot process, review, and sign a contract that quickly, let alone 3 different people. The source argues that this impossible robotic window completely destroys the syndicate's claim of clerical error. It is mathematically impossible, serving as absolute proof that an automated script, a bot, was used to forge these documents.
Armed with this kind of undeniable data, the document introduces what it calls the restitution matrix. This is a purely clinical mathematical breakdown of a legal trap. What the architect allegedly did was systematically map every single act of administrative cowardice, every ignored email, and every 0.4-second forged signature directly to a specific Title 18 federal statute. They didn't just complain about being a victim. Instead, the text outlines how they mathematically converted a narrative of elder abuse and institutional neglect into a rigid, unavoidable, liquidated debt. It's about taking the system's own rules and building an inescapable ledger of liability.
Now, what's really fascinating here is our next forensic strike, centered around 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, which deals with wire fraud. The architect identified what they termed the IP contradiction. So, according to the legal paperwork, the fiduciaries signing these documents were claiming to be physically located in California. However, when the architect ran the server log audit, the geographical metadata told a completely different story. The IP addresses used for the signatures were allegedly routing through proxy nodes situated in the Central Standard Time Zone. The document argues that this geographical mismatch totally fractures the syndicate's timeline, providing irrefutable, cryptographic proof of electronic forgery crossing state lines.
By stacking these shadow crimes together, the text maps out how this behavior jammed the corrupt grid, converting localized issues into what the author categorizes as RICO predicate nodes. We're talking about a civil RICO enterprise. The document alleges mail fraud, citing the USPS transmission of fraudulent financial accountings. It lists wire fraud due to the DocuSign electronic forgeries we just discussed. It outlines obstruction of justice, pointing to something they call the mean judge protocol, where authorities allegedly ignored plain evidence. And finally, extortion under the Hobbs Act, claiming that the fear of medical abandonment was deliberately weaponized against the family. It's a staggering list that frames the syndicate not as careless administrators, but as an organized criminal enterprise.
This accumulation of shadow crimes culminates in what is perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the text, the 2026 hospice siege. The document describes a horrific situation where fiduciaries allegedly denied end-of-life medical transport for the matriarch, dryly citing out-of-network territory limits. The author characterizes this as the ultimate banality of evil. According to the text, this wasn't an institutional accident or a misunderstanding of a rulebook. It was a targeted psychological strike. It was an instance of administrative trauma designed to break the family's will, proving that immense cruelty can be legally codified right into a standard policy manual. So, how does one person fight back against an entire machine? Here is our next forensic strike, and it involves some absolute top-tier legal alchemy. To process the massive volume of data, emails, and legal threats coming from the syndicate, the architect reportedly built and operated a high-density 20-director AI command suite. But here's the genius part. The document outlines a strategy where they legally classified this massive AI architecture as a cognitive prosthetic under Title II and III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. By doing this, the architect ensured procedural parity. The legal stance here is that any attempt by the syndicate to block, dismiss, or restrict this AI tool would immediately constitute a direct federal civil rights violation. They armored their attack with federal law.
Operating from the Peoria Hub, the architect then initiated what the document calls the binary fireback protocol. This is described as a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. First, they automated the immediate statutory deflection of any policy manuals sent their way. Second, they employed liability mirroring.
Every single minute of administrative friction the syndicate caused was tracked, and they automatically billed the fiduciaries $134.75 an hour, adding it straight to the ledger. Finally, they built the logic wall, using incredibly high-density legal formatting to overwhelm the standardized faces and force compliance. They essentially used the system's own massive weight against itself.
And all of that mirroring and billing leads us to this jaw-dropping number, $33.3 million. Now, the crucial point here is that the text insists this isn't just a random pie-in-the-sky demand. It is framed as the exact, strict, mathematical inversion of the syndicate's alleged theft. The document takes the originally missing funds, adds in the thousands of hours billed at that $134.75 special master rate, and then applies federal trouble damages allowed under civil RICO statutes. It is a calculated forensic trap that attempts to quantify every single ignored email, every deflection, and every forged signature into a massive, unavoidable strict liability.
Having mathematically trapped the syndicate, the text shifts to the final establishment of the Peoria Hub. The architect declares it a sovereign fortress. According to the document, by mapping out every alleged crime and building an impenetrable digital perimeter, they created a zero-friction biome. It is a world within a world, entirely neutralizing the syndicate's reach. The text paints a picture of a completely insulated environment, a safe haven where the matriarch could exist with absolute peace, entirely decoupled from the toxic, decaying grid of California that they left behind.
But the architect didn't just walk away. They left a trap. Our final forensic strike detailed in the text is known as the spoliation tripwire. The author declares that the very act of releasing the Aegis monolith to federal agencies is a terminal decree. The legal argument presented here is utterly airtight. Now that the fiduciaries have been served with this metadata, any attempt by them to look away, to delete a file, or to alter even a single line of code will immediately trigger the tripwire. According to the document, any digital tampering from this point forward constitutes an automatic federal admission of guilt and obstruction of justice. The trap is sprung, and the authorities are forced to either act or become complicit.
Which leaves us with a truly profound question raised by this entire explainer. The Aegis monolith isn't just a record of a closed case. The document frames itself as an open-source blueprint for asymmetrical justice. If a single caregiver acting as the architect can allegedly weaponize hexadecimal code and statutory law to successfully dismantle a 40-year corrupt enterprise, it makes you wonder, in our modern reality governed by data, what other decaying institutions, what other standardized faces out there are vulnerable to the absolute, mathematically verifiable truth of an immutable server log? What other corrupt grids are just waiting for their own forensic strike? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Let us know what you think of this blueprint.